as we start accessorizing the figure, we need to look at both the top and the bottom of the figure. So hats. How do we draw a hat on a head? Well, they're pretty easy, actually. You're gonna be a little bummed when you realize how simple they actually are. But you look for this part right here of the hat, and that's an ellipse. There's an ellipse in there. Not the one that goes all the way out to the brim, but the one that stays around the head. So as you draw your oval, you draw your ellipse. And your ellipse tells you where the hat goes. And then whatever the hat is, if it has a brim that faces forward, design that in a square, or design that in a half arc, like a half cylinder, or whatever you need to do to get it right. Well, they're going to be in this square format back here. It's going to curve out here, so it's going to tweak along the way. And then the front of the hat runs flush with the brow. The back of the hat runs flush with the back of the skull. And then you find whatever peak you have to find. And that's how you draw a hat. So in every one of these hats, inside of here, there's the ellipse, inside of here, there's the ellipse, inside of here, there's the ellipse. The ellipse on this one goes up through here. It's not this part here, the brim, but up inside of here. Here's the ellipse, here's the ellipse, here's the ellipse for this hat, 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 here's the ellipse for this hat. My hand is in a bad position there. Here's the ellipse for this hat. Turning this way more. But every one of these has an ellipse that has a relationship to the head, because it's the skull that we're working through. So like if we want to put one of these cowboy hats on a skull like this, and we want the skull to be looking down slightly like this, and we draw where we want the cowboy hat to sit on the head, and then we build upward from there. We build that whatever you want to call it. It's a tapering cylinder, it's an upside down flower pot, but whatever. But you build that in. And then for the cowboy hat itself, you work out the volume from edge to edge. How far out is it going to go on both sides? And then you draw two tacos. There's a half circle here and a half circle over here. The tacos here come towards the middle, so if you put a point right here, or a scoop or a curve or something, here's the two corner points where those scoops are going to go, those tacos are going to go, there and over here. And the same thing happens in the back, and they kind of just loop around like this. And then you build this up in here. You pinch it down by drawing two lines down the middle. Draw these two lines downward, and then there's your scoop. And I'll show you all of this again as we get into the drawing part of it. Hats like this one are a little tricky because they go forward on the head, but as we can see over here, we still find that ellipse, right? Here's the actual ellipse that goes around his head. My bad on that. Here's the ellipse that's going around his head, and then we find the second ellipse that projects forward, and that's where we build all the material on. For all of these hats, again, width of the head for this, because it's a really loose hat. Width of the head for this, it's a really loose hat. Skull for this, because it's a tighter hat. Here's the brow and the hat right here. If you want the hat to have a slightly comical feel to it, then go ahead and extend the hat beyond the skull much further. But be mindful what you're drawing, because if you're drawing realism, then that isn't going to look very good. And then everything else is perspective. This is perspective. Trying to figure out what the angle is of everything. That's all perspective. And that perspective will relate directly back to the skull every single time. Shoes are no different. When we look at the shoes, we go back to a couple things. In my figure drawing class, you start with the door stop, right? The door wedge. I don't know why I'm drawing with this green still. Let's darken that line up a little bit. Dark green. You start with that door wedge, and then as you find the 3D kind of rudimentary volume, and then you start to add out the toes and the curves from the big toe back to the little toe, and you add out the heel, and you bring in the extensor tendons, and you find the actual ankle over here and the other one on the other side, and you put the split where the toes go. And you draw the line back to where all the toes extend back to, and then draw a division between all of them, and then start to find the arch, or in this case the outside edge along the pinky toe and then the heel, and then that outer edge that kind of sticks out a little bit along in here, and then a cross contour that goes up and over the center point of the foot, so we know what the volume is. Well, you already have a wrapper for your foot now, or for your shoe. I'm sorry, you have an object that you can wrap your wrapper around that is your shoe. So just like the hat, we find the angle where the shoe connects, and once we know where this is, then we design around the anatomy. So these shoes are made to cup the ankle, while these shoes are made to cover it. So if it's cupping it, the first thing we want to do is figure out what's the slope. Is the back of the shoe lower than the tongue of the shoe? And if it is, then our ellipse is going to have an angle upward to some extent towards the front of the leg. And then from there, along that arc, we divide in here, and this is what I'm doing. I'm going along the side, under the ankle, and then around the back of the foot. I'm kind of thinking in terms of this being a cylinder. And so now that line is traversing around the back, and then I go to fill in the rest of this along in here, and there's my heel for the soccer shoe over here. Or in this case, we bring it all the way up to here, and I remove this line that I drew for the soccer shoe. Then we have the line that goes all the way up to the back of the boot. And all we have to do now is draw the carved or the formed heel that is inside of that boot. And the boots or shoes will only be a little bit bigger than the actual foot itself. Only a little bit bigger. If you make them a lot bigger, then you're starting to draw cartoons, or you're drawing like graffiti artists would do the Bigfoot, the flare foot design. And with the flare foot design, everything is disjointed in proportion. Now, the one influence that shoes have on our feet that our feet don't actually have when we stand is that the toes are tipped upward slightly. And the toes are tipped upward slightly with the shoe design to help us roll our feet when we walk. So once we get started here, when we actually draw the shoe itself, we draw the footprint on the floor to figure out where the shoe is going to go, where the foot is going to go. Then we find the door wedge, and we design that door wedge up to the ankles, and of course that's going to be connected to the cylinder of the leg. And then we do all of our other stuff, what we need. We divide where the toes are going to go, we figure out where the ankle is going to be, and we find the heel. But before we develop the toes too much, what we then do is we draw the footprint within that space, and we give the toes a little bit of a curve up and around and upward. So this now, there's a little bit of elevation of my foot above the ground plane. This is tipped upward along here. This will come back and flatten out for the heel. And then this is going to be a line that pretty much just comes straight off of this elevated plane that I've created here. That's the sole of the shoe. And this will go up, and wherever I've created that ellipse for the opening of the shoe, that's where I'm going to next spend my time designing around the ankles, the tongue of the shoe. If the tongue goes around the foot because it's a large poofy one, then where does it cut down into where the shoestrings go, and then the shoestrings, if there are any on the foot. So center line of the foot, so we know where the apex, or where the top of the foot is, the topmost part of the foot. And then on either side of that, we run a line along with that edge, which we should have some curvature to. And typically, the shoelaces terminate before where your toes start to bend. So wherever the toes are bending, and you'd have that already drawn into your picture, you end the shoelaces right around there, and then count back. How many shoelaces are there per side? Count the number of holes, and then repeat on the other side. And then when you go to work lacing the shoes, you make sure you lace them just like you would your own shoes, and you follow the holes create those patterns, and then up here you build your tie or whatever else you designed. But to build a shoe doesn't take a lot of work. It just takes a lot of thinking about the perspective and not getting caught up in all these organic little bits and pieces first. If you keep it simple, you build yourself a nice door wedge or a nice block to work with, then everything else is really easy to paste on top of that. And then it's just a matter, again, of remembering your perspective. So whatever design lines you choose to build into it, they feel like they also wrap with the form, turn with the form, go with the form, so it doesn't break the illusion of perspective in there. And then socks. Socks are really easy. Socks are just a matter of finding the ellipse up on the leg and calling it a day. Or if there's some bagginess to the socks, then finding some zigzaggy pipe folds and illuminating them. I'm going to draw in white here so you can see what I'm drawing. These are all pipe folds along here, along in here. And these are going to be where the sock is a little bit looser on the leg. But the pipe folds themselves are only going to go out to the only going to go out a little bit further than the maximum point of the leg itself underneath. Well, that's why, again, we draw those cylinders, because we find the tendons, we find the muscles, and then we place things on top of all of that. And we have our spherical or elliptical or pyramidal or conical or box-like forms that we can then wrap everything else around. And those other things have a maximum point as well. The maximum apex for these areas out here and out here, right? I'll go over here and draw this. Here's the leg. Here's the sock. The sock comes out just a little bit on both sides. But then we have some looseness to the material. So we do stuff like that. And that one's going up and over the ankle. And these also have a maximum point out. If the sock is really tall and it's loose, then it's going to go like this as it goes down, because most of that material is going to gather right up above the shoe. And then it's going to be super loose with super huge folds that go back to the shin bone. And it might even disguise the shin bone by being curvy in between because of how much material there is. But the cylinder underneath totally informs me of these folds that I'm putting on top. And then eventually the cylinder, the pipe forms, kind of get lost in the values that you shade this thing with. And it just looks like folds after a while. Notice how each one of these over here is nothing more than an ellipse going around the leg. An ellipse going around the leg. So, shoes and socks have pattern and design to them too, and it always begins with what the figure is doing underneath and the figure forms that you have found on top, or found first, so that you can draw on top of those. Alright, let's do a couple of examples of an entire figure. Now you're going to do 3 different types of figures this week. You're going to do a seated, a standing, and an active. The seated figure, the standing figure, and the active figure. The standing figure, you're going to do a front and a back. The seated figure, you're going to do several of those. And the active figure, you're going to draw a couple action poses. But those are going to be the 3 types of figures that you work with. And I'll draw an example of each one of those next.